a lot of environmental groups in Texas. That was Brenda Chapa. She did a lot of the background and initial research for this project. And then once her fellowship was over, I picked up from there and finished it out for us. So without further ado, I'm going to start the presentation on assured water supply policies, Texas, and the, which later in our research found out, the southwestern US. So our initial scope was the 17 western states in the United States, which is that green line to the west. But throughout our literature review that Brenda conducted and then what I conducted later on in the fellowship, a lot of the research really pertains to the southwestern states. So New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California. That's where most of these policies are. They're also a little bit more similar to the geography we have, especially in the western half of Texas. So it just made more sense to concentrate on these states for our comparative analysis. I'm going to walk real quickly through how groundwater is permitted and managed in Texas to set the stage for why assured water supply policies are important. And then I'm going to walk through our comparative analysis of assured water supply policies, comparing Texas's framework to the southwestern states that we have here on the map. There has been some encouraging movement on this issue in Texas very recently, which I want to highlight, and then I'll highlight some of our recommendations and then the next steps in the policy and research arenas. So groundwater in Texas is subject to the common law principle of the rule of capture. The rule of capture, you'll often hear it referred to as the law of the biggest pump. And it's based on the common law principle that if you own a piece of land, in the old-fashioned parlance, you own everything from heaven to hell on your property. So everything above and below that parcel is yours by right as that landowner. It's called the law of the biggest pump because the rule of capture, generally speaking, gives landowners the right to capture an unlimited amount of groundwater from the aquifers underlying their land without being liable for injury to their neighbors caused by excessive pumping. That's only in the case unless it's a instance of waste or malicious pumping, but those are very rare and hard to prove. As you can see on this map, we are the only state in the Southwest that operates under this principle. The other states in the region we compared to have different property rights associated with groundwater. I would just like to note, I didn't make these maps. These are some really cool maps from a study done at Stanford University that Brenda found for us. But I think they do a really good job of highlighting both how Texas is similar and different in terms of groundwater management. So even with the rule of capture presiding, there are some constraints on groundwater pumping in Texas, primarily by way of groundwater conservation districts. The districts are political subdivisions of the state, and they are created to protect and balance private property rights with the conservation, preservation, protection, recharge, and prevention of waste of groundwater, and to control land subsidence by groundwater withdrawals in certain parts of the state. Groundwater conservation districts are a discretionary permitting regime. This means that the state provides the districts with really wide latitude as to the parameters of any permitting program they provide. Groundwater conservation districts are allowed to address the local conditions in their areas, and they may also have different parameters from each other outlined in their enabling legislation. As you can see on the map here in red at the bottom corner of the slide, not every aquifer in the state is overlaid by a groundwater conservation district, and most districts in Texas are constrained by county lines. That's why ours have kind of that square and blocky appearance versus the other states you see, which appear to follow kind of either groundwater basins or just general water basins in the state. So this is a really rough outline. There's, of course, a lot more that goes into it, but since that's not the scope of this presentation, if you have any questions, you can email me and we can get into it later. But groundwater conservation districts generally look at whether the groundwater use in their district will meet what are called desired future conditions for groundwater management in the groundwater management area, and they have a management plan. They also look to see if the groundwater will be put to beneficial use, which is this quite long list here on the right side of the slide. Pretty much in Texas and most of the West, that's anything that does not constitute waste. So there's a pretty wide parameters for what is beneficial, but you still do have to prove that the water you are pumping is going to a beneficial use. There are some exemptions to the permitting in both groundwater conservation districts and just throughout Texas. You are exempted from having to get a permit from your well if you are in a district. If you have a small domestic well, so just a well that provides water for your household needs, for irrigating your lawn, anything like that, or if you have a small well that supplies water for your livestock. There are also some exemptions for mining and oil and gas exploration wells. So I've outlined how groundwater is managed in Texas to highlight pretty much two main points, both the rule of capture and then the limited scope and power of groundwater conservation districts. I wanted to highlight that not all of the state is covered by a groundwater conservation district, which means there are few, if any, parameters placed on pumping in the locations that don't have an associated district because of the rule of capture. And even in areas that do have a groundwater conservation district, rapid population growth in the state and climate change are still placing greater pressures on our water supplies. So I think it's important to understand this background and have it in the back of your head when we talk about another way to potentially protect water supplies in the state, which is assured water supply policies. So what are assured water supply policies? I've said it a bunch, I'm going to say it again, but it's important to know that they're very different. They vary widely state by state, as we'll discuss and get into shortly, but essentially the main thing to take away is that they generally require developers to prove that there is sufficient water available for their development. Now, what prove means, what sufficient means, even what water means differs state by state, but that is the general overarching definition. These policies are by no means a new idea. In the southwestern states we analyzed, they've been around for quite a while in some of the states. Though there's some disagreement in the literature on when exactly each state adopted their statute and which state gets to claim to be the first. It looks like that Colorado was the first in 1972, although Arizona often claims it. It's hard to tell due to various revisions in the laws and various amendments that make it difficult to track down the exact timeline. Maybe some clauses have changed over time, but it appears that at least 4 of the states have had some sort of assured water supply policy for at least 40 years. California has had its policy for over 20 years now, and then that left our state, Texas and Utah, without a policy until last year, that is, when we in Texas made a significant step in the right direction, which leaves Utah to hang out by itself off the timeline here. With our recent addition to this list, all of the states we analyzed, except for Utah, have some type of assured water supply policy. I'm going to walk through each of the policies for the states in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but I find this graph the most helpful in understanding the similarities and differences, so we'll spend the most of our time here. From now on, when I say each of the states or each policy, just know that I'm excluding Utah. So each of the state's policies do obviously have a provision related to the quantity of water that is required or that has to be proven to be assured or available. And whether that was groundwater or surface water or is an unspecified type of water, we'll get into later. These type of clauses show up with phrases such as water sufficient in quality is available or water sufficient in quality is assured. I've highlighted the specific language in later slides. Only California and Texas don't appear to have a water quality provision outlined in their assured water policies. The remaining states have at least some type of language related to the quality of the water. There'll be language such as water of sufficient quality or acceptable quality or quality for human consumption. And it's important to note that these quality provisions in those states require the determination of the quality of water over the specified time period that the quantity is must be made available. In Texas, it does not appear that this is the case. We do, of course, have a quality provision, but it appears to be a one-time thing and is not associated with the entire time frame of the policy. So getting into then timeframes of the statutes, it's pretty much split down the middle. 3 have an explicit time frame outlined in the statute or point to a time frame in relevant code in the statute. And then 3 don't have an explicit time frame that we were able to determine, but they still do have some sort of time-related parameters. So California calls for a determination of available water within the next 20 years for the development. Texas's certification splits that. It calls for both a 10-year and a 30-year determination for the certificate. And Arizona calls for a determination for the next 100 years. Meanwhile, a little bit more confusing, Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado have very vague timelines for assured water. They use phrases such as the reasonably foreseeable future, the maximum annual requirements for the development, and through the build out of the development. So there is obviously a time frame associated with the assured water supply certification process. It's just hard to tell what exactly those terms mean. It is assumed, although again, it is unclear, that the local authority can specify what those timeframes mean in the certification process. So 3 of the states don't require the determination of available water if the subdivision that is being developed has fewer than a certain amount of units. California leads the pack here. They don't require an assured water supply certification if the subdivision has fewer than 500 units in it. Colorado doesn't require it if the subdivision has fewer than 50 units. And surprisingly, we're on the upper or the better end of this here in Texas. We don't require it if the subdivision has fewer than 10 units. Now, of course, 3 other states have no such provisions, so it's assumed that regardless, if you're splitting a subdivision into 2 or more units, you do have to have this water availability certification. Arizona and Texas are the only states that appear to specify which type of water must be assessed for the availability certification. Their policies only apply to the groundwater available. So Arizona is only looking if you have groundwater available for the next 100 years. Texas is looking at that 10 and 30-year groundwater availability. The other 4 states don't appear to specify which type of water must be assessed. Again, it could be something where the local authority specifies later on in the certification process, but in the statute itself, there is no specification between or determination between groundwater and surface water. With the exception of New Mexico, the states all give the authority to approve or deny the available water certification to whichever local authority is in charge of platting the subdivisions. And that can be either the county government or the city government. And oftentimes counties and cities come to those agreements themselves on who is in charge of the platting approval process. Arizona is a little bit unique. They have what are called active management areas for groundwater. It's in a specific parts of the state, and they require the active management areas to approve the groundwater certifications, but they also give authority to the local governments as well. New Mexico's law only pertains to counties for the platting, whether that's because only counties have the authority to plat subdivisions, we weren't able to get into before this presentation. So I'm going to talk a bit more about each state just to kind of show you the language, not much more detail than what I just went through on the graph, but I think it's interesting to see the different types of statutes and the different languages that each of the groundwater availability policies or the water availability policies have. So California, they have their water availability policy with Senate Bill 610. It was passed in 2001. You can see some of the language that we pulled out for the chart. So it has to be subdivisions over 500 units. It does have an interesting thing where it looks at the normal, a single dry and multiple dry years within 20-year projection. So you can't just assume that for the next 20 years, it's going to be great atmospheric rivers, flooding, things like that. You have to look at various types of climates for those projections. And then they also call out that you have to meet existing and planned future uses. So if you have an idea that maybe this subdivision will have greater mixed use or other things that would require more water in the future, you do have to consider those. Arizona established its groundwater management code in 1980, which is where they came up with the active management areas, which have very strict regulation for groundwater. Anyone who offers land for sale must demonstrate that sufficient quantity and quality for the next 100 years before you can even market the land. Of course, the active management area is the one who approves that, but local governments are also granted the authority to require it, so that you could have to go through both the management area and the local government. Interestingly, though, in Arizona, you can still sell those lots if you find that there's not enough water for 100 years. But if you're a developer, you have to let prospective buyers know that before the sale. So a loophole there, but hopefully no one's buying a home if it's determined there's not enough water for the 100 years. But Arizona's growing, so maybe. Nevada, again, this is one of those where it's hard to determine when exactly the clause was instated in the law, but it appears to be 1977, or of course later in their code. Any subdivision that's divided into 5 or more lots must show evidence of water which meets applicable health standards, which is key, and is sufficient in quantity, and here's the vague part, for the reasonably foreseeable needs of the subdivision. So what the reasonably foreseeable needs are is unclear. Again, it could be that the city or county can specify what that means during the platting process. Utah, as we said, has enough provisions, but multiple authors in our literature review pointed out that it is still fairly common for developers to provide evidence to the state engineer about the use of water in the subdivision. New Mexico, again, unclear exactly when this statute or the clause in the statute was put in, but it appears to be potentially 1973. They have to have a quantification of the maximum annual water requirements of the subdivision, and they also have to have water of an acceptable quantity or acceptable quality for human consumption over that time frame of the maximum annual water requirements. Like Nevada, unclear what the time frame means, but it could be that the cities or counties are able to specify that in the platting approval process. Colorado, with their Senate Bill 35 in 1972, requires developers to provide, I think, the most stringent qualification. They have to have adequate evidence that the water supply is sufficient in terms of quality, quantity, and dependability. They do not, however, have a time frame associated with the availability certification. They just have a clause that says through the build out of the development. Again, unclear. Maybe the city or county can specify that in the approval process. They don't require it, however, in instances where there's 50 or fewer units. In Texas, in last year, actually in 2023, we passed Senate Bill 2440. And this is where, for proposed subdivisions, specifically in areas where groundwater beneath the land of the subdivision will serve as the primary water supply, the local authority in charge of the platting process must require a groundwater availability certification unless the local authority determines that there is credible evidence that there is and will be sufficient groundwater available for the subdivided tract, and the entire tract is to be served by the Gulf Coast or Carrizo-Wilcox aquifers, or the proposed subdivision divides into fewer than 10 parts. Like I mentioned earlier, the current rule for the certification is to show this availability for both a 10-year and a 30-year time frame, but you don't have to go beyond the 30 years. And we also don't have a quality provision along with that 10 and 30. The quality provision is just for the initial platting process. So while it may not seem like much, our new assured water supply policy here in Texas is a pretty big step forward. The Senate bill amends our local government code, the 2 sections you see here. Section 212 is for when cities are the local authority in charge of the platting process, and Section 232 is when the counties are in charge of the local platting process. With the amendment to the local government code beginning January 1st of this year, so January 1st, 2024, these groundwater availability certifications are now required where groundwater is the main water supply for that subdivision. Again, there are those limited exceptions that I discussed earlier, but it is still a pretty big step forward, especially because before this rule, cities and counties were given the option to require a groundwater availability certification, but there was no requirement that they require it. And of course, that meant that there are quite a few local authorities that did not require subdividers to provide a water availability certification. So again, may not seem like much, but it is a big step forward. The groundwater availability certification in Texas is run by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They're the ones who set out the form and the content of the certifications. They do so in Title 30 of the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 230, which I'm not going to get into today, mostly because TCQ is working on amending that rule for the form and content of the certifications now that this law has been passed. They will begin rulemaking on May 10th of this year. Public comment will open May 24th. It'll run for a month. There will be a public hearing on June 24th, and then we will have a new Chapter 230 in November of 2024. It's important to note that even though this is undergoing rulemaking, you are still required, if you are a local authority in charge of platting subdivisions where groundwater is the main water supply, to require those certifications. You just use what is currently in Chapter 230. So that's a lot to throw at you, I know. Again, we'll have questions at the end, and you can always email if you have questions about any of this at a later time. Through our recommendations, or through our research, Brenda and I developed a couple of recommendations that we think would be really useful for both a more stringent groundwater availability, or just water availability supply in Texas, and just for groundwater management in the state as a whole. One thing that we kept coming up in our literature reviews when people were writing academic papers and law reviews of these is that there is so often very little acknowledgement of the groundwater surface water interaction in these assured water supply policies, especially those that just specify groundwater. Of course, we all know that groundwater and surface water are connected, so it's important, we think, to acknowledge that interaction in these policies. Just focusing on one water supply source probably isn't going to cut it for water dependability in the future. We also think if you do this, if you look at both groundwater and surface water in the certifications, you should require the water availability certifications statewide in Texas. The whole state is facing some sort of water availability issue and will continue to do so as our population increases and drought impacts increase. And so having these certification processes and these certifications for the subdivisions as we move forward will be really helpful for knowing that we're able to provide and care for all Texas residents in the future. With that, we think it's important to expand beyond 30 years. I'm not a hydrologist. I don't know what the exact number should be, but I think modeling off of Arizona with 100 years would be a really good start for this. 30 years is just technically one generation of home ownership. And if you can't pass down your home or have your children rent a home in the same neighborhood as you because there's no water when they grow up, is a pretty big impediment to future growth and to just the future health and safety of Texans. Speaking of future health and safety of Texans, I think it would be really important to include a water quality provision in the availability certifications. Many other states already do this, so it would not be a new thing that Texas is trying to reinvent the wheel for. And again, just because the water is there, it doesn't do any good if you can't drink it, or if your local utility or utility district is having to spend insane amounts of money to treat it, to get it to potable standards. So having that water quality provision put in upfront would be extremely beneficial. One thing that you could do, especially if these other provisions aren't included, is have the state require a groundwater disclosure at the point of sale. There are all sorts of other disclosures that are required for the point of sale, things such as, I mean, this is drastic, but lead paint in the home, just to alert homeowners and let them know what they're getting into. So letting them know that their water supply is strictly groundwater, or letting them know that they have a well on their property and what the associated rights and parameters that are placed on that would be really helpful in letting people make the best informed decision for themselves. With all of that, I don't think all of those are necessarily need to be based on future research, but it would be, of course, very helpful to have research in this area. Of course, every article we read discussing groundwater availability and available water supply policies emphasized the fact that having good groundwater and surface water models and research always helps improve the implementation of any water supply policy. Again, being able to show the interactions between groundwater and surface water, being able to model those and implement them into the certification process, it could be hugely helpful in determining that, or in making sure that those policies are accomplishing what they're meant to accomplish. And then last but not least, the policy in Texas has only been in place for all areas that have groundwater as the main supply for about 4 months now. Not very long, but I think throughout the process, the state should continue to review, make sure that the certification process is working, that subdivisions aren't being approved that aren't realistically able to show, or maybe don't show well enough the process. Being able to review the outcomes of the policy and then expand or improve based upon those reviews, of course, is always helpful, and anything that is something that should be done in all policy outcomes. So I know that's a lot to take in all at once, covered a lot in a very short amount of time, but you could talk for hours on these policies and how water is managed in the West and in Texas. But I think that is a good foundation for today, and I will open it up to questions. So again, feel free to put them in chat or raise your hand, and Nathan will make sure that I see them.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it. We do have a handful of questions whenever you are ready. The first question I have is an investor-owned water company subject to GEAA to demonstrate where their water comes from and long-term availability? And the second part is, what is relationships between water company suppliers and the GCD?
Thank you. So I'm not sure whoever asked the question subject to PIA, could you let me know what that acronym stands for?
Yeah, that's the Public Information Act, that any government entity is required to provide information if requested.
That's a great question. I don't know about that per se. I would hazard a guess that if they are not a publicly owned water company, they would not be subject to the act. I think that's generally how it would be. I would also imagine that just generally speaking, how the laws and policies are set up in the state, no, they wouldn't be. But again, I don't know for the investor-owned water companies. Be happy to look into it though, if you want to shoot me an email. And then let's see the second part: relationship between water companies, suppliers, and the groundwater conservation district. Just so I don't know exactly how specific you're wanting to get there, but the groundwater conservation district is the organization, the state entity that permits water wells. So if there's a water company or supplier in an area that has the groundwater conservation district, the district would be the one permitting those wells.
Okay, so if I can just add a little bit. So for instance, example, Texas Water Company has 80 Trinity wells in Canyon Lake. So, I mean, if a person wanted to try to find out, okay, you're issuing certificates saying, that you have 15 to 30 years of water for new subdivisions, who's checking on them to make sure that's legit?
So I think what I'm understanding is the groundwater conservation district would be the ones to permit those wells, but if there's a subdivision, whoever owns that subdivision or is in charge of that subdivision would have to go to the local authority, which imagine if it's in Canyon Lake, that'd be Kamal County. And it would be on the responsibility of Kamal County with a hydrologist and an engineer to ensure that those certifications the information presented for that certification is correct. How well that's enforced, I don't know. But that's the process as it's set out in the code. I would imagine, though, if you were trying to get that information, if there is a groundwater availability certification, and I do think Kamal County is one of the counties that requires it, which they all do now, of course, but prior to January 1st, I think Kamal County did already require it. I imagine if you were looking for that, submitting an open record, you would go to the Conservation District or Kamal County, depending on what you were looking for.
Thank you.
We're good? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Rachel. Next question is from Marisa. Marisa's asked, within Texas, I've seen counties implement the water availability certification differently. Do you think that the rulemaking process will result in a standardization and therefore limitation of what counties can require in the certification process?
Yeah, thanks, Marisa. I hope so. I know that right now, of course, TCEQ provides what you have to require. And I do think there are certain counties that go above and beyond. Travis County is one of them that goes above what TCEQ requires, I think within the parameters, of course, of the code. But I would hope that with the rulemaking process, it would be a little more stringent. Of course, I don't know what will be required. My hope would be beyond 10 and 30 years, and that a water quality provision would be in there, and that would be a little bit stricter, but just no way yet to know. But all that to say, I think at the moment, of course, counties shouldn't be, if they are implementing it, they shouldn't be able to do it in a manner that is less stringent than what is set out in Chapter 230. They can go above and beyond, but it's kind of like the answer to John's question, who's enforcing that? Hard to say. I think it would be up to citizens to double check and make sure if they're concerned about it.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, next question is from George Vinny, and he asks, with climate change, rainfall will decrease in the Southwest United States by 10 to 30% by the end of the century. Is there any discussion to require review of water availability periodically to adjust plans, if needed, to changing water conditions?
Not that I've heard, especially in the Texas process. I think there are a couple states, California is the one that comes to mind at the moment, that does require those different hydrology scenarios in their determination of the 20 years. Again, there's this 20 years, which is not that long of a time frame for when you're considering the end of the century, but they are requiring an analysis of different climate scenarios. I haven't heard anything, of course, in the way Texas's is. I don't know. I don't think there's anything in Chapter 230 right now which requires that. Good news is, for everyone's question so far, is that there will be public comment periods and hearings for the rulemaking for Chapter 230. So definitely watch that. We can, of course, let people know when that opens. But if this is something you're concerned about, and I think it's a really good idea to watch for that public comment and provide that.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. the last question I have on the chat is from Catherine, and she asks, can developers get around the groundwater availability certification by going to a quotations condo concept?
Not that I'm aware. I don't think so. From what I've seen, I will double check on that, but I'm pretty sure, especially with the new law and the new amendments to local government code, the only way you can get around the law is if you have your water supply being supplied solely by the Carrizo Wilcox or the Gulf Coast aquifers, or if you're going 10 units and fewer. I'm pretty sure, 95% sure, that you can't get around it with the condos or townhome style, but I will double check it, especially if you want to just shoot me an email so I have your email.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it. That's all the questions I have on chat. Is there any other questions that people want to raise their hands to, or want to type in the chat? I guess speak now, forever hold your peace.
So I'm sorry, I can't find the raise your hand thing. This is John again.
No worries.
Are these slides going to be available on your website?
Yes, they will. They're going to be underneath the GEAA Water Wonks page. And we also are recording this lecture as well. So that will also be up on the GEAA Water Wonks page as well. We'll get it up on our website by the end of the work week here, John.
Thank you.
No worries. One more question for you, Rachel. Catherine asked, can we use these maps and slides for publicity?
Yeah, I don't have any issue with that. I'm fairly confident all the information we have is correct. So no, go for it. I've linked to, so for instance, like the Stanford maps that I used, I have linked to the source that we pulled those from. So just maybe a note that the maps provided here were not ones that we developed, but the rest of the slides and the excerpts and tables are.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate it. Okay, Catherine asked, do we need to get permission from Stanford?
Ugh, great question. You know, I've cited it, which is generally, I think, for like a paper, which would be all you're required. I could cite them in a academic manner, so using the APA citations, if that would make everyone feel comfortable for sharing it. I would also would be happy to reach out to Stanford before I affirmatively say yes, you can do that.
Okay. That's it. Okay. George Vinny has his hand up. So George, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up to my earlier question about reviewing availability, especially availability models as climate change occurs. This correlates to that, and that is that West Texas, much of the Southwest, US, the rural states, Arizona, New Mexico, and others, there is pitiful little data available to build these models from. So I would encourage folks, if they're gonna make comments and review these regulations, to also require that the availability be reassessed, not just based on climate, which was in my comment, but also on additional data that might be available now. I mean, we go in best of intentions, but limited information. So I would just encourage that for everyone. Thanks for the presentation.
Thanks, George, for that. I appreciate it. John, I see you have your hand up. The floor is yours.
Yeah, sorry. So I've been looking into some of the groundwater stuff. Since most of these wells are private, is there any data collection done on a well by well basis, or is there pretty much no data on water wells?
I imagine that would differ district by district. I know TCQ, I think it is. And maybe Nathan or Annalisa can jump in here, or maybe it's Texas Water Development Board has a database of wells.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. That's kind of problematic here in Texas because I don't think we have where exempt wells for household use do not have to be monitored. They don't have any flow meters on them, so they are allowed to use that without any reporting requirements. So for the groundwater districts, it's extraordinarily difficult for them to get a handle, especially as we're subdivided into ranchettes, which have their own wells, and so you have a significant amount of water being pumped that is not reported.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Okay, one more question from Catherine. She asked, do you expect litigation challenging the new rules?
In the research I've done, I haven't seen any hints or whispers of litigation. Of course, anything could happen, especially once they publish the like Federal Register and stuff comes out. The rulemaking begins in May. We could see more coverage or anything like that. Personally, I would hope not or think not, mostly just because a lot of counties and cities already, not enough, of course, which is why this rule went into effect, but places already require this because they have the option to require it. So it would be my hope that just by expanding that and making an optional requirement into a required requirement would mean that there's less outrage or chances of litigation. Of course, again, I think until the rulemaking begins, we won't really know how folks are feeling about it.
Okay, thanks, Rachel, for that. I appreciate it. I am going to go ahead and stop the Q&A. If you have any other further questions for Rachel, please reach out to her contact information on this slide, rachel@aquiferalliance.org. You can also visit the GEAA website for more information. And this is where the recording and the slides from today's talk will be posted underneath the GEAA Water Wonks page. I also want to go ahead and promote our next lecture, which would be on May 22nd, 2024 at 3:30 here on Zoom. I shared the Zoom link over the chat right now, but the lecture for that talk is going to be about the regional flood planning process and why conserving floodplains are important. We're going to have a duo conversation talk with our GEAA's Executive Director, Annalisa Feast, and GEAA's Technical Director, Debbie Reed. Also accompanying the two of them, we're also going to have a video presentation from David Sakaitis, who is from the Mile High Flood District. And we're going to be showing a video that he presented to the San Antonio River Regional Flood Planning Group about this topic as well. So check out that link. We will have registration open up starting tomorrow. But we'll also be shooting out newsletters and e-posts about the upcoming Water Wonks talk in May as well. And that's all I had. Anything else?
Yeah, I think just two things to close out. One is just I would encourage everyone who's interested in this topic, which I think is all of us here. It's a really big opportunity in Texas. I would encourage you all to watch for that public comment period, to watch for the rulemaking and submit these great suggestions that people have had today, or any suggestions you have. Texas has needed an assured water supply policy for a long time. Again, this is a small step, but actually, honestly, a really big step forward for us. And if there's anything we can do to make it even bigger, would be great. And then Nathan talked about the May 22nd Water Wonks. And then I also want to put in a little plug for our 20th anniversary party, May 9th. That's a Thursday. It's just a chance for all of us to celebrate the work GEAA has done for the past 20 years, but also celebrate all of you who've made that work so fulfilling and have let us do what we have done for the past 20 years. So if anyone is interested in coming to King Williams in May to party with us, you can find information on our website for that. That's all I have. So thank you all.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it. I also went ahead and put our URL link to the GEAA anniversary party on May 9th on the chat as well. But with that, we are done. And I just want to thank everyone for attending today's Water Wonks lecture. And you are dismissed. So thanks so much for coming, and I appreciate it. GEAA appreciates it as well. And just have a good rest of your days. So thank you, guys.